There's a pretty standard way in which you become a student. Disciple is another name for it. I too, like years ago, many moons ago, I became a student at Peace River Bible Institute. And, like most people, I applied to attend their school to become a disciple or a student of their teacher. And this has actually been a fairly standard practice is the student will find their master. When someone wants to learn from someone else, the student will seek out the master and then ask to become their disciple or their student. The intriguing thing, with Jesus, this doesn't seem to be the case. Well, kind of. I'm going to get more into that. There actually seems to be multiple pictures going on. But Jesus actively called his disciples is a very dominant presentation of what he does in the synoptics. You remember that scene from Chosen? So Jesus is walking along.
Matthew.
Even much more famously is the scene that we probably all can remember. We visualize it in our minds. We've read it in the Bible. And that is when Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John to become fisher of men. So he goes on the Lake of Galilee and he actively calls them to become his disciples. John, in John chapter 1, verse 35 to 42, presents a slightly different picture. Jesus, after being baptized by John the Baptist, is walking along, and John the Baptist then tells his disciples, who one of them happens to be Andrew, of who Jesus is. And they approach him and say, Master, where are you going to stay? And he says, come, I will show you. And the discipleship process starts that way. A few verses later, Jesus then calls Philip. So back similar to the synoptics presentation of James and John, Peter and Andrew being actively called by Jesus. But then on the flip side, we have Philip go tells Nathanael in that whole scene underneath the fig tree to come and meet Jesus. So again, now Jesus is being passive and the students are actively seeking him. It's interesting, a little aside there. Nathanael doesn't become one of the 12. So Jesus actively and passively acquires disciples in his short ministry in Galilee. But not all of them become the 12. That's actually very interesting that there are 12 disciples selected and designated to be apostles. Click on this link above here or over here, whichever one it is, to see a video that I've done recently, but why Jesus chose 12 disciples to be apostles and not just be the same as all his other disciples who were learning from him. Recently, I've become a really big fan of studying the historical Jesus of E.P. Sanders, the historical figure of Jesus, which is very easy read to do. And if you want a much more academic level, it's pretty much same material, just much more sources and academically put as E.P. Sanders, Jesus and Judaism. But what I like about Sanders is he actually actively tries to figure out, the Gospels present here, what do we actually think Jesus did historically? Not the Jesus of faith per se, but what the Jesus, the man who lived in Galilee, was like. At the same time, not like a lot of academics where he's just like, Jesus, it's religious, it's all made up and just throws it all away. E.P. Sanders tries to stay true to the historical figure that we know in the Gospels, but he tries to work it out, and it's just a wonderful little piece to see. So one of the things that E.P. Sanders points out is the difference in the synoptic Gospels of Jesus calling his students or his disciples is in Matthew and Mark, Jesus teaches as one who has authority, as it says in Mark 1:22, that his own presence seems to command that Peter and Andrew and then James and John follow him. There's no real explanation of why they leave their nets and go follow Jesus. But then it seems that Luke, who most scholars believe are written a few years later than Matthew and Mark, he adds an extra element to that story. In Luke chapter 5, verse 1 to 11, Luke presents a different narrative. So he has Jesus on the boat and he is teaching. And then there's a test of faith when Jesus commands Peter to throw out his net on the other side, despite the fact that Peter's been fishing all night and has caught nothing. But through this test of faith, there's this miraculous catch of fish. And that is when then Jesus calls him. E.P. Sanders goes a little bit different on this, and I don't really agree with him on this, but he says that Luke added that story. That story is not part of the tradition of the church, but Luke heard of the story of Peter and Andrew and James and John being called as fishermen to follow Jesus, and then just dropping their nets and leaving. He's like, there's got to have been a reason, a motive that these men would leave everything they had to follow Jesus. And then Luke writes down the story of this miraculous catch of fish. And that is what motivated them. Like, oh, if this man can catch fish, we don't need to fish all day. We will follow him because that's going to be better for us. The intriguing thing is, in John, it's presented a little bit different. Andrew, one of the two that John the Baptist's disciples, in which he tells about Jesus, in which he goes to follow him, is a very passive manner in which Jesus is actively seek to him. And this happens in Bethany, not Capernaum, where the story happens later. You can reconcile these two if you want, in that Andrew had become an active disciple of Jesus down in Bethany, in the Jordan River area where John the Baptist was discipling. And the Gospel of John seems to present this. And then there must have been a little bit of falling away in which Andrew, for whatever reason, stopped being involved in Jesus' ministry, and then later on goes back up and joins his brother again fishing up in Capernaum. And then when Jesus comes there and actively calls him again, it's a renewal, a re-meeting together, and he becomes an active disciple again. So the two stories could be reconciled. On the other hand, E.P. Sanders says probably not. That the Gospel of John is trying to present John the Baptist as subordinate to Jesus, and therefore creates this story. I think both stories should be held one in each hand with a little bit of a tension, because in history, there's always tension over perceptions or understanding. But the idea that Andrew could have known Jesus, had an active ministry with him for a while, and then kind of fell away for a while, is possible. Either way, E.P. Sanders is pretty confident. I think it's fairly easy to understand that Jesus did actively call fishermen. 4 of them being Peter, Andrew, James, and John. That he actively did call them, and there was some kind of scene that happened on the Sea of Galilee in which they then became disciples of Jesus. E.P. Sanders doesn't mention this, but something to keep in mind is, how long do you think Jesus was actively involved in his ministry? Most scholars put it between 6 months and 3 years. The reason I bring that up is, if you have a too short a period of time, you don't really have time for Andrew to become a disciple and then fall away and then become a disciple again. So then you have to mesh it together much more tighter. If you have Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist 3 years, 4 years maybe even 5 years, which very few people go that far, and then before his crucifixion, you have lots of time there in which Jesus could begin a ministry, sputter out, Andrew leaves him, goes up to Capernaum, Jesus goes back up again, meets with him, and they become engaged again in their discipleship relationship. One of the biggest takeaways we should take from Jesus and his calling of the disciples is exactly that he broke convention, that he stopped, that he tried a different approach. Maybe because he felt his time was short and he actively had to get involved. He didn't have time to wander around Galilee for years, teaching and preaching and doing miracles and waiting for disciples to come to him. He wanted to actively select people. Or maybe because he felt there were certain people that he wanted in his group. And to have those people, he had to actively call them. Like I've said in another video, I'll click the link up here, that it seems like Jesus was actively trying to fulfill prophecy when he calls fishermen. So maybe that was on his to-do list, get disciples that are fishermen. So he actively calls Peter, James, and John to become his disciples. It doesn't explain why he actively called Matthew, unless again, he wanted to be associated with the tax collectors, the outcasts of society. So he actively reached into that category because chances are very high that a tax collector is not going to think right away, oh, the local rabbi's in town. I bet you he would be willing to disciple me. No, his thoughts are probably, oh, I am not worthy to be part of that person's ministry because he is a good, righteous man and I am merely a tax collector. So Jesus actively overcame that hurdle by calling Matthew to become his disciple.